A guy was invited to be the speaker at a congress, and he was told, "You are very important to us, and that's why we want you to be the first speaker the second day, right after the cocktail party. We're going to start with you." And he arrives, and there was only one person listening. 10 minutes go by, and there's still just one person. So he decides to start with his presentation, and the single person sitting there listens and claps at the end. Once the conference is over, his presentation is over, he comes down and he says, "Thank you very much for listening." And he said, "Well, you cannot leave because I'm the next speaker." Thank you very much for being here, for participating in this second day at 8:30 a.m., the second day right after the cocktail party. There's a lot of you here. I want to thank especially Mr. Botero, former Minister Botero, President of FASECOLDA, for inviting us, and not just him, the FASECOLDA team as well, Maria Claudia, Luis, Carlos. I also want to thank Ingrid. I want to thank the board of directors, Mr. Javier, and all the members and affiliates for considering the Ministry of Housing. Very special greetings to government officials. There's a very large number of them here today. Here I see officials from the superintendency. There's Luz Angela, the delegate, Claudia Granada, Juliana Lagos. I also see the Ministry of Finance, the URF director, all government officials here today, and those that will arrive later this morning. Good morning. Greetings also to the members of the media. Thank you all. This association is 43 years old. It's a relatively young association in comparison to others that are 70 or 80. There are several associations in Colombia that are older. Some are close to a century, 100 years old. But this association is very young, but a very important one. If you ask a Colombian who reads and is well informed, name 5 associations of Colombia, they will surely name FASECOLDA. And it's a young association, a very important one for 2 things. One, because of the type of work it does, the soundness of its answers, the constructive aspect of its statements, but also by the nature of its task. This association is a partner to the rest of associations. And what I want to do here today is to reflect on 2 things. First, to share with you our vision of the housing policy, how this is doing at present. And also I want to think about this hinge, how the insurance sector is important, but not an accessory. It's very important. It's very, very important in what we foresee during President Ivan Duque's administration as our goal, our direction, or our North Pole in terms of where we want to go. So these are the 2 reflections I want to discuss today. What are the tasks at hand in the midterm and long term in terms of joint work, not only to recover the dynamics of the sector, but to meet the strategic goals that we have established during this administration within our National Development Plan? So without further ado, I think I shouldn't be pointing here, but over there, yes. The insurance sector, a partner for the housing policy. And as I mentioned, 2 reflections. This is the context, how we're doing in their policy, and second, our relation with the insurance sector. I call the first part of my presentation the housing policy, a state policy for growth and equity. Each of the components in this title defines an important reflection for us. A state policy for growth and equity. Why a state policy? First of all, because I remember very well when we were barely starting this administration, when we were in the with the previous administration in our conversations, in the handing over, the analysts and members of other associations and administration talking about the housing policy, and everybody agreed that this policy should be a state policy. We were at the technical secretariats in discussions, and everybody said how good it would be for President Duque to make this policy a state policy. And I asked them, what do you mean by that? And I always received a different answer. So this sounded to me like a lot of words, a bunch of words together, but an idea that repeated itself continuously: a state policy, a state policy, a state policy. We agree in that the housing policy should be a state policy, and it is very clear to us what being a state policy means. For this government, a state policy is a stable, articulated, and comprehensive policy. What is a stable policy? It is one that has two things. First, a legal framework with clear rules of the game based or looking at the medium and the long term. Secondly, for it to be stable, it needs to have guaranteed resources. For us, stability cannot be simply money in certain programs that are not defined and will be improvised a long time, over time. But it can also not be a series of provisions where there's more discourse than resource. A stable policy then needs to have these two things. Second, what is an articulated policy? It is one that, when asked about housing, you don't answer what's traditionally been answered. Well, if you want to know how housing is doing, I can answer with you about the urban housing, but if you're going to ask me about rural housing, go ask somebody else. Or if you're going to ask me about subsidies, well, it depends. If it's subsidies coming from employers, let's talk about the CAS and the co-ops, etc. But if it's a general participation program, you can ask me. No, an articulated policy is one that can look at what's urban and rural comprehensively, and in turn to coordinate different actors as the cajas de compensación and the national government. And third, what's an integral policy? It is one that can talk about acquisition versus leasing, the purchase of new housing versus home improvements, and also improvements or new housing versus old housing or renovated housing. These that tell you that would be telling you that you concentrate only on one thing. No, if we do remodeling versus or at the expense of new housing, no, that's not a comprehensive policy. There's one that has challenges in the quantitative as well as the qualitative side, and we need to address both in an integral way. So to move from discourse to action, for us, a stable, articulated, and integral or comprehensive policy is based on several things that are a reality. I would dare say that President Duque's administration has made housing policy in Colombia a state policy. Why? Because it guaranteed the resources to the subsidies program through 2025. One of the largest resources delivered in this country were given in August to ensure continuity of housing programs, not through 2 years, no, through 2025. I remember when I was at the Asociación Bancaria, the Banking Association, what happened upon the term of the programs. We saw a lot of delays, and once the programs were updated, again, the businesses will materialize again. There's an end being put to that. Subsidy programs in Colombia are fully financed and guaranteed, not through 2021, through 2020 or December of this year, not until next year, not until the end of this administration. No, they are guaranteed through 2025. There's very few policies of a government that can say they have regulatory and resource guarantees through 2025. Well, the housing policy has it. What does this mean in practice? That any builder that has a project in the midterm that's thinking about investing in 2 or 3 years' time can have guarantee that upon conclusion of his building process, he will find the institutional supply of the housing ministry ready to back his investment. And at the same time, Colombians who have decided to purchase a home, that's not something you do overnight. Let's go buy a house this weekend. No, which is a medium and long-term planning. Those who want to start saving to meet their dreams of being house owners. In 5 or 6 years' time, can be sure that at that time, the state will be there with the guaranteed subsidies plan. That is what it means to have a stable policy, a state policy. Articulated, rural and urban housing is not going to be atomized. Thanks to the development plan, we'll have a single ruling entity. It won't be like in the past where we had 7 agencies in housing. No, there will be now a rationale, there will be a scale, and this efficiency will translate at the end of the day in greater opportunities for more Colombians to finally be homeowners. The same happens with the other actors that we used to say they're not public, so it was difficult to coordinate. No, that's not true. We put an end to the arbitration that existed between the subsidies Mi Casa Ya and the FOBIs, which was not arbitration for money, not that one had more money than others, also in terms of procedures. Well, we were able to not only to standardize the procedures through a decree that was enacted some weeks later, but we were able to bring together the resources, Mr. Botero. Now, for the first time, we can give a Colombian who makes less than 2 minimum wages, 50 minimum wages together, and adding the FOBIS resources with those of Mi Casa Ya plan. What we're doing in practice is helping more than proportionately those who have less in a good policy design so that we can give 41.4 million pesos as down payment for those who make less. And that way we bring together efforts by FOBIS with government efforts. In the past we were competitors. Now we're adding together this. We're at the base of the pyramid. That is having an articulated policy. And comprehensive or integral because we're making progress in these programs. And we're proving that in Colombia we can do 100,000 home improvements and 94,000 new housing offers. So if you tell me that a policy goal is at the expense of another, as if a public policy were a trivial exercise of sum zero, no, we don't believe in this. We believe we can pursue a goal in qualitative terms and another in quantitative terms. So the first message of my presentation is this government is obsessed with making the housing policy a state policy, an articulated, comprehensive, and stable policy. And it is obsessed in that discourse, which is a common discourse, a common place, to become something concrete. And there's 4, 5, 6 policy measures that are very clear that pass from the philosophy to concrete things that give the sector peace of mind. Now, let me reflect about growth. People are very concerned about the growth of this sector. I have to say that I'm not only concerned about the growth of this sector, I'm concerned about the growth as well as the equity. We need a balance to achieve both things simultaneously because this sector not only needs to grow and grow a lot, this sector also needs to be a very powerful instrument for redistribution of income in Colombia. And look at how complex this slide is, because this slide shows me a very clear reality. In the construction sector, all the social goals are set based on the government-sponsored housing, government-subsidized housing. All the goals in the development plan on the social side are placed on the VIS and VIP, and these only add up to 80% of the sector's GDP. Correction of the speaker, 20% of the sector's GDP. The non-VIS sector is the one that determines how the construction VIP did. When we look at the VIP, it's now different from the non-VIS GDP. Social housing does not give me a construction GDP. This doesn't mean it doesn't do GDP. It does a lot of GDP in the chain, but at the end of the day, what you account for is the added value of the final stage. The final stage is very similar to the sum of the materials and gives me very little GDP. Here in Colombia, we start the building of 200,000 units. Have or VIS, have or not. So half and half, the VIS and the BIP give me 10% of the GDP. And my goal is to meet the goals of what's social, but also to make the sector grow. That's why I need to have a very clear agenda for the VIS and a very clear for the non-VIS, VIS. And I would not feel pleased, or this administration either, we're going at 4, 5, or 6% as a sector, but the social housing or government subsidized housing is falling. And this sector is also not happy with meeting all the goals of the National Development Plan and having negative growth. Mr. Botero, 4 days ago or less, you talked about former Minister Guillermo Perry, deceased former Minister Perry. And in his last column, former Minister Perry mentioned this in the El Tiempo newspaper, that government subsidized housing was that met the entirety of the government's goals and that could meet all the goals with irregular GDP data. Look at this contradiction. The day before yesterday, unemployment figures were published. 260,000 jobs disappeared. In the construction sector was the opposite. It generated 169,000 jobs. There's a story there which is a lie. Oh, those are civil works. That's the 4G. That's not the construction sector, because the construction sector grows very little. That's a lie. 58% of these jobs were in housing, the construction sector. 58% or 98,800 jobs. So while a country in a month has a record of 160,000 jobs destroyed, 260,000, the housing sector opened 100,000 jobs. 100,000 jobs published yesterday. How can these 100,000 jobs be compatible with a negative GDP? How can they be compatible? The law is met and for all the sectors. You don't hire people for non-initiations or for non-production. How can you be contracting 100,000 additional employees and have a negative product data? The response was in the previous slide and in the column by former Minister Perry. The answer is very clear. Those 100,000 people who are being hired are going where? To government subsidized housing. And they're producing a lot of these VIS, government sponsored housing, but this figure is not being reflected in the GDP. Although this year, the GDP of the building sector has been decreasing by 1.1, negative 1.1, and we are not pleased with this growth. We believe this sector should grow at least 4%. Although the first data that we have with positive growth in the last 10 trimesters occurred in President Duque's administration, the last 2 are really bad. We need to turn this around, and we are very concerned. But this slide shows me that there's very clear indicators of economic activity as employment, which are signs that there's something happening in this sector, something good in terms of productivity. So I want to divide this into VIS and non-VIS, or the government subsidized housing. There's people who say, no, that's a very shy performance. And for me, the first of these graphs cannot be controverted. I don't see how other people see it, or analysts or new analysts. I see what's shaded here is what's happened since August 7 of last year, what has happened during President Duque's administration. If you ask me what I see in that slide, I see a line that was in the negative part that starts having results increasingly less negative and reaches positive expansions that it had never had in its recent history. That's what I see. What are we talking about? About the beginning of government subsidized housing or social housing, the most important indicator of productivity. How many houses start construction? And these in Colombia not only grow at 2 digits, they grow at 20%. This data is not good. It's incredibly good. It's one of the best we have had in the history of Colombia. It is very good that this government social housing is doing well. It's not really doing well. It is doing extremely well. And we want is that this very good pace we can maintain over time. What would worry me that these initiations, and it would also concern the superintendent, that they grew and the inventory inventory turnover as well. Why? Because they will show that we're launching new projects, starting construction, but we're not selling them. That's why for me, the second indicator is also as well, the stabilization of inventory turnover. As initiations grow, these two signals together, what show me is a phenomenon. Government subsidized housing built in Colombia is housing that's sold. We're building more than before, but social housing that is built is sold, period. Why? Because the turnover doesn't grow while they expand, initiations expand extraordinarily. Social housing, what we build, we sell. Everything is wonderful? No, there's things that concern me. For instance, that the launches, which is the prior indicator to an initiation, which is simply getting the idea in motion, these are not recovering as well. Today's launches will be the initiations of the first semester in June next year. I don't like this figure for the launchings. I have a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that these launchings have fallen in 6 cities. Basically, when we talk about launches, we have 10 and 12% in all of Colombia, and it's falling in 6 cities to 5, and the average gives me 0. What do these cities have? These are cities where the land was very expensive, and we were asked for a redefinition in the caps of the social housing. This was done a month ago, and I have an expectation, for instance, that in Antioquia region, we have launching of more than 20,000 units in response to these new market signals of the redefining the caps. So that's a concern, because these are 6 cities where we made certain measurements, and we need to revert this. This needs to become results, and I'm hoping that by December, we have good figures in launches. And lastly, licensing. So why are you concerned about licenses if licensing is growing at 10%? That's false modesty. I'm worried about the 10? No, I'm worried about the growth. It grows and it falls. It grows and it falls. Growth is good. We need to follow this very closely so that this indicator doesn't fall back to negative figures. Just as the data is good in the VIS, in the government-sponsored housing, I also have to tell you that high-value housing, the data is not good either. In fact, without nuances, high-value housing, the data is bad. Look at the rotation or the turnover of housing in the VIS, which was good. In the high-value housing, this turnover has not stopped growing since 2011. It is not a phenomenon of this year. In fact, this year it's corrected a bit from 16 months to 15 months, but that's nothing extraordinary. But it's sort of normalized itself. But it's a phenomenon that's been normalizing in the last 10 years. Having an inventory turnover that more than doubles in the practice means one thing, which is that during almost a decade, many units have been built that have not been sold. Colombia should have a stock of non-VIS units of 1,500 to 2,000 units. We have close to 9,000. Close to 9,000. This market with 2,000 could absorb and be selling this. We have close to 9,000, but not close to 9,000 from August 6th till today. No, we have close to 9,000 that have been built over a decade. Colombia is increased its stock of non-VIS housing, which today is the great challenge for the growth of this sector. Initiations grow negatively. How can you think of initiations growing and builders having building credits for new launches if they have not got rid of their stock, their inventory? I am convinced at the government, we are convinced that if we don't help to the disaccumulation of this inventory, the non-VIS sector will not see new construction or new initiations, and therefore the growth of this sector will not turn around. To recover growth, VIS grows at 22 and we continue growing negatively. If VIS grew at 50, we would grow 0. On the side of the VIS is not the growth agenda. The growth agenda is in the non-VIS housing and especially in the disaccumulation of this inventory. It is clearly identified what we need to do to disaccumulate this inventory. And I was asked recently, Minister, what worries you most about the sector? And my answer was the non-VIS inventory, clearly. That's what concerns me most. However, not everything is bad. There's signals that I believe are very positive. Here in Colombia, there was a big discussion about dismounting the non-VIS pledge, that subsidy to the middle sector. And it was said that government Duque's administration was what was hurting this mid-sector where everybody held hand and ran happily around, and government President Duque's administration got rid of this and hurt this. No, I see that this middle sector, the mid-segment of the non-VIS was in the downfall. On August 18, it stopped decreasing and started decreasing a bit less. And for the first time, in a period of 3 years, it is positive and it's growing at 8.4% presently. It is President Ivan Duque's administration who's carrying this unburied corpse. No, it is not his fault. No, the middle segment housing for the first time in 3 years is growing during this administration, and this is a positive signal rather than a negative signal. And we're seeing more sales. We not only see it in the sales, but we also see it in the launches. Launches is the same case. We're growing at 2 digits. So my reading of this is, there's a problem in the non-VIS sector, but contrarily to what some analysts say, is not in this sector. It is focused especially in the highest value housing, that's 500,000, 600,000, 1,200,000. That's where this negative growth, where the launches are growing negatively, and that's where the challenge lies to turn around the growth data. We have taken several measures. I tend to get too excited and I'm extending myself too much. We're taking several measures. I'm going to go very quickly over them to reflect very quickly about equity and to talk about the insurance sector. I really like this slide, especially the development of the right-hand side. This is from the National Planning Department. It's an exercise that takes public expenses and distributes by income quintiles. What we see here is, in terms of equity, it's unpresentable. What we're seeing in the first, on the right-hand side, is one type of public expenses where 50% of the money goes to the 20% wealthiest group. That's the pensional expense. This is the extreme of inequitable expenses. 50% of the money of everyone's taxes goes to the 20% of the wealthiest people here. The second is the most progressive of the expenses in our structure of the social policy, which is education. In education, the first 2 quintiles of income, that is the 40% poorest population, receive almost 50% of the resources. So to the 40%, I'm giving 50% of the resources. I'm investing more than proportionately. The education is undisputably a source of equity. It reduces the Gini coefficient in Colombia. And third, the one we see in orange, is the housing. I don't know what you see here, but I think that this histogram inverted is not as concerning as that in the pension sector, but clearly is not as good as the expenses in education. In housing, we're simply spending 34% of the resources on the poorest 40% of the population. If you ask me if I like this, no, the government does not like this figure. We believe it's a process. Yes, it's a process because the subsidy programs are de-skimmed. Who receives the subsidy programs first? Those who make 3 or 4 minimum wages, those who are closest to the financial closing, and then the programs cascade down. That's like the natural process of public policy when leveraged on subsidies. That is, this is the data that we expected, but it's something that we are not happy with. What do we believe? We believe that the first 2 income quintiles receive more than proportionately the public resources of the subsidies. Said differently, we want for the housing policy to be a great driver of equity in this country. And we're doing 2 things. First, Given that effect, the hypothesis is true, and this proves it. It's been proven. If I increase subsidies, I can more easily cascade down to the base of the pyramid. Reducing the number of subsidies is like concentrating these on those who have 4 minimum wages of income. If I reduce it to its minimum, it goes to those with the 4 salaries. If we do it similar to what we had in 2017, 2018, it goes down to 2 or 3 salaries. If I really go deeper, I start reaching the 2 salaries or the first salary. And this, on the right-hand side, is very clear. We receive a program, Mi Casa Ya, which gave the families with less than 2 minimum wages only 40% of the subsidies. Today, we're delivering 60% of the subsidies. Did we make any parametric changes? No, not yet. No parametric changes. You know what we did? We increased the number of subsidies. Doubling the number of subsidies guarantees that we start reaching the base of the pyramid. We inverted the matrix. It's no longer 40-60. Now it's 60-40. Are we happy with this? No. It should be 80-20, but we're going along the right path. It's been a year. We are doing well in terms of redistribution. And when I say that we increased the number of subsidies, is that in 2015, 16, 17, and 18, until August 6th, we delivered less subsidies, 39,000 subsidies. And in this year of administration, these 422 days, we've delivered 43,000, 53%. What does this mean? That in a little over a year, we've delivered more than half of the subsidies of a program that's been in existence for 4 years. That is building upon what's been built. That means deepening a program. Mi Casa Ya works, and it works very well. And what did we do? We deepened it so that it reached the base of the pyramid. In Colombia, 40 or 50 subsidies were given on a daily basis. Last week, we gave 130. In one day, 130 Colombian families became homeowners. In a single day, one day, 130 Colombian families with the intervention of the Colombian government. Second, concurrence. I said it earlier, Mr. Botero, the possibility of giving 50 minimum wages to those who make less than 2 salaries in income. That is indeed a parametric change. So we maintain the subsidies policy at the same level, but we give a bit more to those who make less. And that's also going to help me change this in terms of the scope, in terms of equity. And the semillero de propietarios or homeowners seed base, well, we want the sector to start growing again at 4%. But we want a sector to start growing at levels of 4%, but where the first 2 income quintiles receive more than 60% of the resources. We want to recover the sector's leadership in terms of growth, but, and listen very well, to radically change this histogram. We want it to be as good or more than that of education. We want the housing policy to be a driver of growth in this country, but that it also be a driver of equity, because we don't believe those who say that if one thing can be achieved, it's at the expense of another. The insurance sector plays a very important role for us. A very important role for us. Not only, it's a matter of completing markets. My demand is extended, my supply is extended, and it brings me to a balance that's socially more desirable. This is not simply protection of the equity. It's not a simply protection of the equity. It's development of the market. I see the insurance sector not only as the one who charges a premium for protecting an asset, I see it as the one that allows me that my housing programs reach more and more people. And let me tell you why. Well, and now today that I'm a bit philosophical, it also has another philosophical connotation that is important. Here we're not simply insuring homes, Mr. Botero. Housing is the business, the most important business a family, an average family makes in Colombia throughout its lifetime. It makes many deals, many thousands of transactions, millions of transactions done through over a family's lifetime. None of the transactions is as important as buying a home. So what this sector does in this sense then is not insurance the walls and the bricks. This sector ensures social mobility of this country because housing is the materialization of a dream of that who's in the process of social mobilization of becoming middle class. What seals middle class in Colombia is owning a home, is becoming a homeowner. So in this sense, you're not insuring the home, you're insuring social mobility. I've gone very romantic with what I'm saying. And there's 5 elements that in which I believe you play a fundamental role. 3 of them from a demand side and 2 on the supply side. They're very evident, but let me tell you about them. What do we do on the demand side? We protect demand against, first, bad construction practices. Second, we protect housing financing. And third, we protect against natural catastrophes. Not in all are we doing too well. I'll mention later where we need to work more. And secondly, we protect the housing programs and the constructive process. Let me tell you how bad building practices, how we protect against these. There's no consensus in the world about the mandatory character of building practices. But in certain countries, it's by law. In other, it's by market. Where is it by law? In France, Spain, Italy, Finland, Canada, Japan, and Colombia. On residential, in the residential sector. Where in the public projects, where there's state monies in Saudi Arabia, in Mexico, and where is it in the process of adoption in Brazil and Morocco? There are not a few, but it doesn't include all of them. This is a group of countries where it's a legal provision. In certain for government programs, in others for all types of home purchasing. But there's not few, but they're not little developed countries. There's others where more than 90% of the population acquires insurance without the regulation. That is, it's a market practice that's fully accepted. And where? In England, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. You can tell me, what did we do with the flag? Australia's the one with the brightest star. So in the United Kingdom, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, more than 90% without regulation acquire the insurance. So these are the international benchmarks. If you can see in Latin America, we have Brazil in the process of adoption, we have Mexico adopted solely for public projects, and we have Colombia, which is at the is the leading country. It's a pioneer because this is positive. Colombia is a pioneer in Latin America in home insurance against bad construction practices. In what? In the regulation of the secure home law. This law comes before our administration, but it was regulated during President Duque's administration. This is the insurance that protects against what? Flaws in the structural studies, in the foundations, etc. It's a 10-year law. We have a challenge, a short-term challenge for the correct implementation of this decree. The decree is ready. It's been launched enthusiastically. And what are we doing now? We're preparing ourselves for when it comes into force. And with the technical supervisors, we have 2 things on the agenda. The first thing is how we're going to certify them, how we're going to assess them, how we're going to create this repository, and secondly, where we're going to record them. There's an entire timeline here that shows us what are the activities planned. I here would like to highlight 2 dates for your sector that are important. You have a concern about when this is going to be ready. I'm going to give you 3 dates. Number 1, in a year's time, in 13 months, every day counts. I want to be very accurate. In 13 months, we will have ready the record of technical supervisors, the registry. By November this next year, this entire schedule, this timeline, it will take us to November of next year to have this registry ready. To have this registry, we need to implement the tests in June of next year. implement this test in June next year, we need to fulfill a series of activities that you see listed here that begin in October of this year now. And they start with what? With an agreement with ICFES, ICFES. The signing of this agreement will set into motion a schedule that will result in us giving the test in June next year and the registry on the air, working, operable in November next year. Our commitment to this sector of the implementation of this decree, the Amparo Decree, is that we will have the registry operating and functional with a good assessment that in addition will be well-built, but also will be sustainable in its financial model by next year. Secondly, the housing financing.
We have insurance that protect the financial institution, other the debtor. I'm going to go faster because I have only 5 minutes. In literature, we see the aspect of funding, financing, and I want to take advantage of the fact that you are working in this area of financing. This is not debt protection. I need the way in which we think about the role of the insurance sector in financing in a country with so much problems in financing is that it gives real value to the collateral. One of the main problems that we have for this mortgage portfolio that is so low is the value of the collateral of the asset of the housing to be backed by this collateral so that people can get credit, a loan. If I have the collateral strengthened by the insurance, this is a powerful instrument of financial inclusion on the part of the credit for housing. And this is, I greet the president of the Commission 7, Jairo Cristancho. Welcome, Dr. Cristancho. I greet you to this meeting. In the case of Colombia, we have insurance for financing. Some are mandatory. Basically, which ones? The ones of fire and earthquakes. But we have complementary services in insurances that have been developed, but not as fast. We have as well insurance against natural disasters. These are very poor indicators. Globally, you can say, let's benchmark ourselves with the OECD of high-income countries have insured only 40%. This is not the asset because this is done based on catastrophes. It's 40% of losses in the case of these incidents. So this is clear to you, but not to us. 40% of the losses, these incidents in the developed world are guaranteed. If we go to lower income countries, this figure is lower. But although in Latin America is above the intermediate level countries, in Latin America is 15%. I see the other way around. 85% are what is lost in the natural disaster in Latin America is lost, is not insured. 85% of what is affected, to be more accurate, in the case of a natural disaster in Latin America, is lost. We have international experiences with, once again, this is a mandatory based on market. The state has been a leader in the adoption of insurance for natural catastrophes. It's mandatory in Turkey and in Chile. It's very interesting to explore this, specifically in countries with a high vulnerability to this type of events, such as earthquakes, to establish this as a mandatory. In other countries, it's not mandatory. New Zealand and Hungary is something that the market established, but is not mandatory. And this is the figure of Colombia. You are acquainted with this. You are the source of this information, together with the Bank of Opportunities and the Superintendency. My concern is that the level of insurances in Colombia is only 3.1%. We are speaking about fire and earthquake. You can see the level of vulnerability. 86% of the population is located in areas that have a threat of earthquakes, high and intermediate. So we have 86% vulnerability, only 3% of insurance penetration is a challenge. I am philosophical today, and I am having reflections on equity. This is a slide of great concern to me because not only the fact is that Colombia, first conclusion is that Colombia is unprotected. Colombia is unprotected in the case of a natural disaster. Housing in Colombia are not protected in the case of a natural catastrophe. But housing in Colombia is less protected at lower type of income levels. If there is a natural disaster in Colombia, is non-neutral in aspects of equity. If Colombia becomes a reality, there's natural disaster, immediately we have an expansion on the Gini coefficient. We have an increase on lack of equity because we have exposed more the lower income groups. So there is a challenge not only on market development but as well on equity. Finally, I have 3 minutes, 45 seconds, and I'm going to end up on time. We have this type of programs. In the Pacific Alliance, we have a good practice. These housing programs have insurances. The policy of housing in the Pacific Alliance has an insurance for construction. Colombia started this for many years back. These housing programs that have developed in Colombia historically have done this with the support of the insurance sectors. We have any type of government, any type of situation in Colombia, we have a housing policy that has been backed up by the insurance sectors, and this is going to be in the future and has been in the past. Not only for those programs that have continuity, but as well in the new housing programs. The insurance sectors plays a basic type of role in these owners, seedbed or semilleros or propietarios. We have an insurance for leasing, for the rent, which is a basic part for this program, but as well there is initial payment done by the government to this sector because these monthly payments are paid ahead of time. I want to emphasize these figures on the bottom, the market opportunity that exists for the insurance sectors regarding these owners' seedbed, where we have the possibility to have 240,000 collaterals to promote this type of program, to have different types of collaterals, one for the rent, 200,000, this type of collateral. Dr. Botero, very important market opportunity that could be the leverage of this program. The same thing happened with Casa Digna, Vida Digna, a small type of work, but with importance for the insurance companies. You may think that this is a sector that, regarding the supply side, is much aware of the importance of the premium. If you compare this track of 98 to 2016, you say this is great because this is a sector of housing that has a specific protection of project development. But if you get a figure, this is just 3%. And when you see this in terms of invoicing, billing of the insurance companies is less than 1%. The insurance for the supply of the building sector is less than 1% of your invoicing. Being positive, you have an opportunity for growth in this sector of buildings and construction. This is my last slide. If you put this type of information on development, this is like looking the world in groups of 25%. Regarding poor construction practices in Colombia, we have regulations, we have a plan that is going to be implemented, and we are doing what is required. If you ask me how we are doing in housing financing, I said that we need a little bit more. We need to improve in insurance sector that is non-mandatory. This aspect of all risk insurance, the coverage is very low in Colombia, and I do respect this aspect that we have to think about the product, how the product in marketing aspects could reach the base of the pyramid, because just to sell all risk insurance for high and six income levels, it's okay, but you have to think about a product so that the all risk insurance reaches the income level 3 and 4. So this is just 1/4 missing. In natural catastrophe, we are lagging behind. We have an agenda to work. I just gave 1/4, but it could be empty, this chart. The housing programs have the insurance programs. This is a full pie chart, and in construction processes, although the track is positive, we still are below 1% of your invoicing, of your billing. We hope that it will account to 5% of your billing, your invoicing. In this case, we will have a sector that is growing in order and being safer. I had 4 minutes more, Dr. Botero. Thank you very much.